You found it. Your home for the best content on your favorite team, the Fighting Tigers of LSU. Do us a favor, subscribe to the channel, leave your comments below, and be sure to smash that like button. Every year, Bill Connolly, who does the SP Plus over at ESPN.com, does his S&P Plus rankings, and he updates them throughout the offseason. But part of the SP Plus, it really measures three things. It's, and I'll oversimplify it, but it's how good has your team been lately, how well have you recruited, and who returns from last year's team. And he uses his metrics to put all those together and come up with a ranking, and that's his SP Plus ranking. And so it evolves as the offseason goes along because you have guys that transfer and guys that declare for the draft, and you have players coming in and so on and so forth. So these rankings evolve throughout the offseason, and next week he's going to drop the first rankings, but today he listed the returning production. Now, I'll go through that in a second, but just for some context, last year, I want to highlight some of the returning production numbers from a year ago. Like, the number one team in the country a year ago for returning production was Florida State. Florida State returned 87% of its production a season ago, and as we saw, Florida State ended up having a really good season. They went undefeated. Now, they got screwed out of a playoff spot, but they went undefeated. Michigan, which won the national championship, was number 5, had the 5th most returning production from a season ago. So you could look at those and go, yeah, well, that makes sense. These teams return a lot of production. They did really good. Well, number 7 in the country was Texas A&M, and their coach got fired. But a few spots behind them, at 9, was Missouri, and Missouri went to the New Year's Six. So there's something to be said for this, right? It makes sense. You return a lot of production, and you should be pretty good. Well, Southern Cal was 14th, and they didn't have such a hot season. But another playoff team, Texas, was 19th in returning production at 74%. So you can look and say, okay, Washington was 3 spots behind them at 22. They were a playoff team. So Michigan was 5, Texas 19, Washington 22. That's 3 of your 4 playoff teams. Now, the outlier was Alabama. Alabama, out of 133 Division I programs, Alabama was 125th in returning production. So, and they made the playoff, obviously. So, just for some context, LSU last year was 32nd in returning production. Okay, so just for context, again, Florida State was 1, your playoff teams, Michigan 5, Texas 19, Washington 22, then Bama 125, way down there. So that was returning production of a year ago. Let's look at this year. Again, the rankings aren't out, but this is just the returning production. Number 1 in the country, Virginia Tech, returning 86% of its production. So if you're looking for a team that might unexpectedly take a step, Virginia Tech could be a good bet. Just behind Virginia Tech is Iowa State, and then Nebraska. So if you're a big believer, in the returning production metric, Nebraska could be that team that this year takes a big leap. We'll see. The ones that I thought were interested that I highlighted: Colorado 15 with Coach Prime. And then Texas A&M, again, A&M a year ago was 7th in returning production. Jimbo got fired. This year they're 18th in returning production. So even with all of the exodus, they've still got 72% of their production returning. I also wanted to look at this year's playoff teams to say, okay, the teams that were in the playoffs, Texas, Washington, Michigan, Bama, where are they in returning production to say, could they maybe have a return trip? Well, the highest ranked among them is Texas. Texas returned 70% of its production. They're 25th overall. The rest of the playoff teams from this year, let's just say a return for any of them, according to this metric, would be highly unlikely. Alabama is 115th in the country in returning production at 44%. 115. Michigan, you can leave it there, Paulie. Michigan is 128, and Washington is 130th. So the point being, Bama 115, Michigan 128, Washington 130. That's returning production. 3 of the 4 playoff teams have been decimated. So you wonder why, like, there aren't going to be many people super high on Michigan this year, not just because they lose Jim Harbaugh, but they lose 64% of their production. They return only 36% of their production on either side of the ball. Same thing for Washington. So, yeah, man, like Bama, Michigan, Washington, you would expect just with the amount of production they lost, take a massive step back. Now, yes, you could supplement via the portal, and a big determinant factor of whether or not you're going to be able to replace that production is how you did in the portal with guys that could step in immediately and help you. So that's why I think there's 2 other really interesting schools on this list. LSU is one of them, and Ole Miss is the other. Because LSU, while you lose the Heisman Trophy winner, you're losing 2 first-round draft picks at receiver, you're losing your interior defensive line. LSU is 60th in the country in returning production. 60th. Ole Miss is 68th. So what that really is going to come down to for Ole Miss is, how did you do in the portal? The guys that you're bringing in, you bring in Logan Diggs at running back, but you lose Quinshon Judkins. That doesn't feel like a what and what. How do you replace that productivity? That is a massive question when you look at this. Yes, there are other variables because we're going to see what freshmen come in that have a huge impact. And there's going to be another portal cycle as well after spring football. So these numbers are going to continue to evolve. It's not a final number, but it's a pretty clear indicator when you can look at it and say, okay, look at the teams who are at the bottom of the returning production, and it's kind of evident of how how a season might go, right? TCU played for the national championship, was 118th in returning production. Like, there are outliers like that, but you can also look at circumstances and understand why a team's season might go the way it did. But then there's Georgia. Georgia this past season in 2023 was 80th in the country in returning production, and they were right there on the doorstep of return trip to the playoff. I mentioned Bama was 125th and got back into the playoff. So really it's a matter of, how did you do in the portal replacing the production you lost? That's the gigantic question. And it's the unknown until you tee it up and kick it off. But it's pretty clear when you look at the playoff teams from this year, Texas is best suited to get back. They're 25th in the country in returning production. Bama 115, Michigan 125, Washington 130. It would be a massive upset to see any of those 3 back in the college football playoff. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact, and be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.